On the planet Viridia, the concept of a true day was a forgotten myth, a whisper from the first generation's logbooks. The world was tidally locked, a captured stone in the gravitational grip of its crimson star. Helios, one hemisphere, the Scorch, was a blistered hellscape of molten rock and superheated winds, forever facing the sun. The other, the Frost, was a tomb of nitrogen ice and perpetual darkness, turned eternally away. Between these two absolutes lay the Twilight Belt, a thin, temperate ribbon of land where the sun was a permanent fixture on the horizon, a bleeding smear of red that never rose and never set. Here, in the perpetual gloaming, humanity clung to existence in a settlement they called Terminus. The name had started as a joke by the founders, survivors of the crashed terraforming vessel, the Dawnbreaker. But generations later, the irony had curdled into a simple statement of fact. They were the end of the line, a failed project the Terran conglomerate had long since written off and forgotten. The few thousand souls in Terminus were not rejects or exiles, but ghosts. The descendants of scientists and engineers who had dreamed of making a new Earth and had instead found themselves marooned in a planetary purgatory. They survived not with advanced weapons or powerful defenses, but with a deep, hard-won understanding of the strange world that was their prison and their home. They had learned Viridia's rhythms, its dangerous secrets, and its fleeting bounties. Ilar was a creature of this twilight, her senses honed to its subtle language. At 22, she was a whisperer, one of the few who ventured beyond the settlement's crude sonic fences into the Glimmerwood, the vast, bioluminescent forest that bordered Terminus. The wood was Viridia's heart, a place of breathtaking beauty and lethal cunning. Towering fungi, their caps shimmering with soft, pulsating light, created a canopy of eternal, shifting constellations. The air hummed with the vibrations of spore-releasing flora and the chitinous clicks of unseen predators. To most, it was a place of fear, but to Ilara, it was a library of life. She moved through the glowing undergrowth not as an intruder, but as a part of its complex web. Her patched synth leather clothes were rubbed with the sap of the shy vine, a plant that mimicked the scent profiles of its surroundings, rendering her almost invisible to the keen senses of stalker lizards and razor-wing moths. She carried no rifle, only a long, carbon fiber staff tipped with a resonating crystal and a satchel filled with sample jars and nutrient paste. Her currency was not credits, which were useless here, but knowledge. She knew which glowing mosses were neurotoxins and which could be ground into a potent antibiotic. She knew the fruiting cycle of the sun blush fungi, whose spores could be refined into a high-energy fuel source that powered the colony's water purifiers and heaters. Today, she was hunting for something far rarer, the ghost orchid. The plant grew only in the deepest parts of the woods, a parasitic bloom that drew energy not from the soil or light, but from the planet's latent electromagnetic field. Its petals, translucent and shimmering, contained a compound that could stabilize the failing neural interfaces of the colony's oldest members, the last direct links to the knowledge of the Dawnbreaker. As she pushed deeper, the familiar hum of the forest felt off. It was a dissonance in the background thrum, a static she felt in the bones of her feet more than she heard with her ears. The air grew colder, and the natural, chaotic glow of the fungi seemed to dim, overshadowed by a new light. It was a crisp, blue-white luminescence that did not pulsate with life, but held a sterile, geometric perfection. She saw it first on the petrified trunks of ironwood trees, delicate, crystalline lattices that spread like frost, catching the dim light and refracting it into sharp, cold fractals. It was beautiful, unnervingly so. She approached cautiously, her staff held forward. The crystal was cool to the touch, humming with a low, resonant frequency that made her teeth ache. She scraped a small sample into a sealed jar, her brow furrowed. She had cataloged every mineral formation and fungal species within 100 kilometers of Terminus. This was new. This was alien. Over the next few weeks, the crystal frost, as the colonists began to call it, spread with an unnatural speed. It crept out from the scorched side of the Twilight belt, a shimmering tide that seemed to flow over the landscape. It was a source of endless fascination. Geologists marveled at its complex structure, while children dared each other to touch its humming surface. Some even saw it as a blessing, a new resource to be mined, a sign that Viridia was still evolving. Elara did not share their optimism. She watched as the native flora reacted to its presence. The vibrant glimmerwood fungi near the crystal's edge began to pale, their soft light replaced by the same cold, blue-white glow. The shy vine withered, its camouflaging properties failing as the crystal rewrote the very chemistry of the soil. The ecosystem was not adapting to this new element. It was being overwritten, consumed, and replaced by a sterile monoculture. The first human victim was a prospector named Kyle, a rugged man who spent his days charting mineral deposits near the edge of the scorch. He returned to Terminus one evening complaining of a headache and a strange ringing in his ears. Within a day, a faint, web-like pattern appeared on his skin, shimmering with a faint blue light. He became quiet, withdrawn, his eyes losing their focus. He would stand for hours, staring towards the encroaching crystal fields, his lips moving silently. The colony's medic, an old man named Wren, was baffled. It resembled no known planetary contagion or radiation sickness. When he tried to take a biopsy from Kyle's skin, his tool sparked against the tissue as if striking quartz. The man's very flesh was changing, hardening, crystallizing from the inside out. Elara knew then, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her gut, that this was not a geological event. It was a biological one, an invasion. She took her sample of the alien crystal and the data she'd collected on its spread to the colony's small council of elders. They listened with worried patience, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of a single energy cell lantern in the cramped command center, a repurposed section of the Dawnbreaker's fuselage. "It's a parasite," she explained, her voice low and urgent. "It's not just growing on things, it's converting them. The soil, the plants, and now us. Kyle isn't sick. He's being assimilated. Whatever this is, it doesn't want to kill us. It wants to become us." Her words were met with skepticism. Elder Maeve, the head of the council, shook her head. "Elara, your knowledge of the woods is respected, but you're a biologist, not an xenologist. This is beyond our understanding. It could be a natural cycle, a planetary fever." Yorick, the head of the security patrol, scoffed. "She's just scared of something she doesn't recognize. We need to be studying it, not running from it. Think of the power locked in that crystal. It could be the answer to all our problems." Frustration burned in Elara's chest. They didn't see it. They were looking at the individual trees and missing the terrifying shape of the forest. They saw a resource where she saw an extinction event. She left the council chamber feeling more alone than she ever had in the depths of the Glimmerwood. She knew she couldn't make them believe her with words alone. She needed to show them. Her mind raced back to her knowledge of Viridia's volatile chemistry. There was a particular species of lichen, the igneous moss, that grew near volcanic vents on the edge of the scorch. When exposed to a specific high-frequency sonic pulse, the moss released a highly acidic enzyme capable of dissolving rock. It was a defense mechanism, one the colonists had learned to avoid. But what if it could be used as a weapon? The plan was reckless, bordering on suicidal. The igneous moss fields were dangerously close to the main front of the advancing crystal, but it was the only idea she had. She didn't ask for help, knowing Yorick would forbid it. Instead, she found two others who trusted her intuition more than the council's caution. One was Ben, a young engineer who could modify her staff's resonating crystal to produce the exact frequency she needed. The other was Lyra, a scout whose speed and silence in the field were second only to Alara's own. Under the permanent crimson twilight, the trio slipped out of Terminus. They moved through the altered landscape, a world that was becoming increasingly alien. The air was colder here, and the silence was profound, broken only by the incessant, low hum of the crystal. The Glimmerwood was a ghost of its former self, its trees encased in shimmering blue sheaths. They found Kale standing amidst a grove of crystallized trees, perfectly still, his body now more crystal than flesh. He didn't react to their presence. His head was cocked as if listening to a distant song, a faint blue light pulsing gently from his chest. The sight chilled them to the bone. Lyra stifled a gasp, and Ben's hand tightened on the modified staff he carried. This was no longer an abstract threat. It was a body-snatching horror, and Kale was its patient zero. They pressed on, finally reaching the volcanic vents. Fields of the rust-colored igneous moss clung to the heated rocks, and the air smelled of sulfur. The crystal lattice was only a few hundred meters away, a solid wall of blue that seemed to drink the very light from the air. Ben handed Alara her modified staff. "The frequency is locked in," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "But the feedback will be immense. You'll only get one shot before it burns out the core." Alara nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the staff. This was it. A single, desperate gamble based on a biological theory. She took a deep breath, planting her feet firmly on the rocky ground. She pointed the staff not at the crystal wall, but at the sprawling field of igneous moss that lay between them and it. "Get back," she ordered Ben and Lyra. She activated the staff. A piercing, high-frequency shriek, just on the edge of human hearing, erupted from the crystal tip. The sound wave washed over the moss field. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the rust-colored lichen began to bubble. A thick, greenish vapor rose from its surface, coalescing into a rolling fog of corrosive gas. The enzyme, aerosolized and potent, drifted on the slight thermal updraft towards the crystal wall. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Where the acidic fog touched the crystal, the blue light sputtered and died. The perfect's geometric lattice hissed, buckled, and began to dissolve, sloughing off and steaming, molten chunks. The sound was like 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once, a shriek of agony that was not physical but psychic, a wave of pure static that washed over them, making Alara cry out and drop to her knees, clutching her head. A vast, 10-meter section of the crystal wall dissolved into a black, bubbling sludge, revealing the scorched, native rock beneath. They had done it. They had heard it. But the victory was terrifying. As the psychic scream faded, the entire remaining crystal wall began to glow with an intense, furious light. The low hum rose to an angry, targeted thrum. It was no longer a passive, creeping frost. It was awake. It was aware. And it now knew that the strange, soft creatures living in the twilight were not just another resource to be consumed. They were a threat. Alara looked at the enraged, pulsing wall of light, then at the horrified faces of her friends, and knew that her reckless act of defiance had not saved them. It had only started the war. The psychic shockwave that followed the dissolution of the crystal wall was not a sound, but an invasive presence, a spike of pure, malevolent intelligence driven directly into their minds. It was a feeling of being seen, understood, and utterly hated. Alara, Ben, and Lyra fell back, stumbling over the scorched rocks, their hands clamped over their ears as if to block a noise that was already inside their skulls. The vast crystalline field before them pulsed with a furious, deep blue light, the rhythm of frantic, enraged heartbeat. The low hum it had always emitted was gone, replaced by a rising, harmonic shriek that vibrated through the soles of their boots. "We have to go now," Lyra screamed, her voice a thin thread against the overwhelming mental pressure. She was the first to recover, hauling a disoriented Ben to his feet, while Alara struggled to clear the blinding static from her vision. The war had begun, and they were standing on the wrong side of the battlefield. Their retreat was a frantic, desperate flight. The path they had taken to the Ignis Moss fields was no longer safe. As they ran, they could see the ground behind them changing. The crystal was no longer creeping. It was surging forward, a tidal wave of geometric patterns that consumed the rock and soil in its path. Shards of razor-sharp blue crystal, the size of spears, erupted from the ground where it advanced, a spontaneous, aggressive defense. They were no longer just running from a phenomenon. They were being actively hunted by the landscape itself. The mental pressure was a constant assault. It was a chorus of whispers at the edge of hearing, a feeling of profound despair that sought to slow their steps, to make them simply give up and lie down to be consumed. It was a promise of peace, of an end to struggle, of joining a vast and eternal consciousness. It was a beautiful lie, and Alara fought it with every ounce of her will, focusing on the rough texture of her staff, the burn in her lungs, the frantic pounding of her own heart, anything to anchor her in her own mind. It was Lyra who spotted him first. She stopped dead, her hand shooting out to halt Alara. "Look," she breathed, pointing towards a ridge silhouetted against the crimson sky. It was Kale, but he was not the vacant, statue-like figure they had seen before. He was moving, descending the ridge with a smooth, unnatural grace. The blue light in his chest pulsed in time with the enraged thrum of the main crystal field. He was an antenna, a remote limb of the greater entity, and he was moving to intercept them. A new kind of fear, colder and more personal, gripped them. This wasn't just a force of nature. It had a face now, the face of a man they had known, a friend they had failed to save. "We can't fight that," Ben stammered, his eyes wide with horror. "Alara, What do we do? Ilara's mind, honed by years of surviving the Glimmerwood's predators, kicked into high gear. They couldn't outrun the crystal's advance, and they couldn't confront Kale directly. They needed to use the environment. The real environment. The one that was left. This way, she commanded, veering away from the direct path to Terminus and heading deeper into a network of narrow, winding canyons. It's longer, but there's more cover. Lyra, you're on point. Find us a path he can't follow easily. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse. They scrambled through ravines and over rockfalls, the harmonic shriek of the crystal entity echoing off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell how close their pursuer was. They caught glimpses of Kale, a shimmering blue figure moving with relentless speed across the high ridges, always seeming to know where they were heading. He did not need to see them. The crystal entity guided him, a shepherd directing its first wolf. They were exhausted, physically and mentally drained by the psychic assault. It was in a moment of near collapse, as they rested behind a rock slide, that Ben made a discovery. He had been tinkering with the burned-out staff, his fingers moving out of nervous habit. The feedback, the frequency Ilara used. He mumbled, his face pale with exertion. When the crystal wall screamed, the staff recorded the feedback loop. It's a mess of harmonic data. But, listen. He fiddled with a small dial on the staff, and a low, distorted hum emanated from the cracked crystal tip. It was a discordant, ugly sound, a warped echo of the crystal's own shriek. Instantly, the oppressive mental pressure lessened, the whispers in their heads faded, and the feeling of being watched receded slightly. It's a jamming frequency, Ilara realized, her eyes widening. It's like fighting fire with fire. You're broadcasting noise on its own channel. It wasn't a perfect shield, but it gave them a bubble of mental clarity, a small fortress in the storm. It was enough. Their return to Terminus was not triumphant. They stumbled through the main gate, ragged, bleeding, and half-mad with exhaustion, to be met by the stony face of Jorik and his security patrol. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his hand resting on the grip of his pulse pistol. "You left without authorization. You violated protocol." Before Ilara could answer, the colony's main alarm siren began to blare. From the watchtower, a frantic voice crackled over the comms. "It's the crystal. It's moving. It's at the sonic fence." The skepticism on Jorik's face evaporated, replaced by disbelief and then dawning horror. Everyone ran to the settlement's perimeter wall, a crude barrier of rockcrete and salvaged ship plating. Beyond it, the sonic fence, a series of pylons that emitted a high-frequency pulse to deter Viridia's megafauna, was under assault. The blue crystal tide had reached them. It was not stopping. It was flowing up against the invisible sonic barrier like water against a dam, piling up, growing thicker. The air crackled with energy, and the hum was now a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the settlement. Ilara, Ben, and Lyra's story tumbled out in a frantic rush in the council chamber. They presented the burned-out staff with its recording of the crystal's scream and the sample of the black sludge, all that remained of the dissolved lattice. Elder Maeve stared at the sludge, her face ashen. Jorik, his authority shattered, paced the room like a caged animal. "You provoked it," he roared, turning on Ilara. "This is your fault. You turned a geological curiosity into an attacker. It was always an attacker," Ilara shot back, her voice raw with fury and exhaustion. "It was just quiet about it. It was consuming our world, our people, and you wanted to study it. I found a way to hurt it. And that's the only reason we know for certain what we're up against. The argument was cut short by a tremendous boom. One of the sonic pylons at the northern perimeter had exploded in a shower of sparks. The crystal had not broken through the barrier. It had learned from it. It had analyzed the frequency and produced a counter-frequency, a focused sonic lance that shattered the pylon's emitter. A section of the fence went dead, and with a horrifying grinding sound, the crystal tide began to pour through the gap. Panic erupted in the settlement. People screamed and ran for their homes. The illusion of safety shattered, but Alara's voice cut through the chaos. Ben, the jamming frequency. Can you broadcast it through the whole settlement's comm system? Ben, already pale, turned white. The power drain would be massive. It could black out the entire grid. Do it, Maeve commanded, her voice finding its steel. Jorik, get your people to the northern wall. Use the mining charges. We're not sealing the breach. We're creating a fire break. A big one. Jorik, for the first time, looked at Alara not with contempt, but with a desperate, unspoken question. He was a man of protocols and patrol routes. This was something else entirely. Alara met his gaze. The Ignis Moss enzyme, she said, her mind working faster than it ever had. It's our only real weapon. But we can't get to it. We need to find another way. A catalyst. Something acidic. Ren, the old medic, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. The reclamation plant. We have vats of hydroponic accelerator. It's a concentrated nitric phosphoric acid solution, highly corrosive. A desperate plan began to form, a gambit born of chaos and necessity. While Jorik's teams used explosives to blast a deep trench in front of the advancing crystal, a volunteer crew frantically began rigging the settlement's agricultural sprayers, filling them with the volatile hydroponic acid. As night, or what passed for it in the perpetual twilight, wore on, the settlement of Terminus transformed into a frantic fortress. The jamming frequency broadcast by Ben created a dome of psychic static over the colony, a vital respite that allowed people to think and work without the entity's crushing despair. But outside that dome, the crystal's assault was relentless and intelligent. It stopped advancing in a straight line. Instead, it sent out thin, crystalline tendrils that moved like serpents, probing the sonic fence for other weaknesses, testing for harmonic vulnerabilities. It was learning. It was adapting. At the northern wall, Alara stood with Lyra, watching as the first wave of the crystal tide reached the newly blasted trench. It paused for a moment, then began to flow downwards, filling the chasm with its eerie blue light. Now Alara yelled into her comm. From the top of the wall, the agricultural sprayers roared to life, unleashing thick jets of concentrated acid into the trench. The reaction was a nightmare of chemistry. A furious, hissing scream erupted as the acid met the crystal, a sound of pure, physical agony. A toxic, yellow-green vapor boiled out of the trench, and the advancing crystal front dissolved into the same black, bubbling sludge she had seen in the wilds. They had held the line. For a moment, a ragged cheer went up from the defenders on the wall. But Alara didn't join in. She was watching the main body of the crystal field beyond the trench. The furious blue pulsing had stopped. Instead, the entire field was glowing with a calm, steady, analytical light. The enraged, chaotic attack was over. It had tried brute force and failed. It had tried a probing assault and been thwarted. It had learned about their sonic defenses, their explosives, And now, their chemical weapons. It fell silent, a vast, thinking, alien entity sitting just beyond their walls, and in that silent, calculated stillness, Ilara felt a deeper and more profound terror than ever before. The initial, furious assault had been a tantrum. Now, she realized with a sickening certainty, it was going to start thinking. It was going to strategize. And Terminus had just shown it all of their tricks. The silence from the crystal field was more terrifying than its rage. The defenders on the wall of Terminus stood in the crimson twilight, their makeshift acid sprayers dripping, the acrid smell of the dissolved sludge catching in their throats. They had won the battle, but the oppressive, thinking stillness of the entity beyond the trench felt like the prelude to a far more devastating war. Inside the command center, the mood was grim. The initial euphoria of survival had evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization of their predicament. They were besieged by an intelligence that learned from every interaction, an enemy that could reshape the very ground they stood on. The acid worked, Jorek stated, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. He looked at the holographic map table, which now displayed a live feed of the dormant crystal front. But we used nearly a third of our hydroponic accelerator reserve. We can't sustain that kind of defense. Elder Maeve's face was etched with exhaustion. And each time we show it a weapon, it learns to counter it. First the sonic fence, now the acid. What's next? We are a finite colony with finite resources. It is, for all we know, a planetary organism. Ilara, leaning against a bulkhead, felt the weight of their gazes. She was no longer just the whisperer, the eccentric biologist. She had become the reluctant expert on the apocalypse. Her mind wasn't on their immediate defensive, but on a more fundamental question. Why was it here? What did it want? The assimilation of Kyle and the land wasn't random. It was purposeful. It was reproduction, or consumption, or something for which they had no words. It communicates, she said, thinking aloud. The psychic pressure, the scream, Ben's staff recorded. It's a form of language, a hostile one, but a language nonetheless. We've only been screaming back at it with explosives and acid. What if we tried to listen? The idea was met with incredulous stares. Listen to what Jorek scoffed. The whispers that tell you to lie down and die. No, Ben interjected, his eyes alight with a frantic, intellectual curiosity. He had been hunched over a console, analyzing the complex waveform he'd recorded. She's right. It's not just noise. There are repeating patterns, complex harmonic layers. It's more like a broadcast, a chaotic, angry one, but it's structured. He brought a filtered version of the sound wave up on the main screen. It was a complex, beautiful, and terrifying visual, a fractal of sound. If we could isolate the core frequency, Ben continued, maybe we could talk to it, or at least understand what it's broadcasting. The concept was radical, a desperate leap of faith. While the council debated the ethics and sheer insanity of trying to communicate with the entity, the crystal itself made the next move. It was not an attack, but something far more insidious. Small, crystalline spires began to grow from the dormant field, like needles rising from the earth. They were perfectly spaced, elegantly formed, and they began to hum, each at a slightly different frequency. The humming spires acted as a network, a distributed antenna array that began to focus the entity's psychic energy with terrifying precision. The generalized pressure that Ben's jamming frequency had held at bay was now being refined. Individuals in the settlement began to experience targeted phenomena. A technician working on the water purifier suddenly collapsed, screaming about a symphony of shattering glass inside his head. A woman in the habitation block began quietly weeping, convinced her long-dead husband was calling to her from the crystal fields. The entity was no longer trying to batter down their mental walls with a sledgehammer. It was picking the locks. It was finding individual fears, traumas, and hopes, and weaponizing them. The jamming frequency was becoming less effective. The psychic static, unable to block these new, needle-sharp intrusions. Alara knew they were running out of time. She sought out Ren, the old medic, in the colony's small infirmary. The place was crowded with the new psychic casualties. "Kyle," she said, her voice low, "when he was first changing, you said your tools sparked when you tried to take a biopsy, like he was turning to quartz." Ren nodded, his weary eyes looking over his afflicted patients. His flesh was petrifying, but it wasn't just his skin, his neural implant. It was going haywire. It was broadcasting, not receiving. A stream of garbage data, but it was coming out of him. An idea, cold and terrible, began to form in Ilara's mind. The neural implants were standard issue for all colonists, a legacy of the Dawnbreaker. They allowed for data interface, comms, and medical monitoring. They were a direct link to the human brain's electrical signals. What if the crystal wasn't just attacking their minds, but interfacing with their technology? She raced to Ben. The implants. It's using our neural implants as receivers. That's how it's targeting individuals. It's hacking us. Ben, it's hacking our brains. Ben's face went pale as the implication hit him. They had a Trojan horse inside every single colonist's head. "We can't just turn them off," he stammered. "They're hardwired into the autonomic nervous system. A forced shutdown could kill the host." The situation was now impossibly dire. Their enemy was not just at the gates. It was already inside their heads, using their own technology against them. The plan to communicate seemed less like a desperate hope and more like their only option. With Elder Maeve's reluctant approval, Ilara and Ben began their work. They needed an amplifier, something that could broadcast a signal powerful enough to be noticed by the entity. And they needed an interface, a way to translate human thought into the harmonic language the entity used. The solution they found was terrifying. They would use a human volunteer, someone whose neural implant could be modified to act as a focused transmitter. They would essentially turn a person into an antenna. But who would volunteer for such a mission to open their mind completely to the psychic onslaught of an alien intelligence that had only shown hatred and a desire to consume? The answer came from an unexpected place. Jorik, the security chief, a man of rigid rules and physical force, came to them as they worked. His face was a mask of grief and guilt. "It's my son," he said, his voice cracking. "Leo, he's only 8. He's one of the ones. Hearing things. He keeps asking me when the Crystal Men are going to come and take him to the Singing Mountain. I can't protect him with a wall or a gun, but I will do anything to stop this. Let me be the volunteer." The procedure was a piece of frantic, brilliant improvisation. Ben worked for hours, bypassing safety protocols and rerouting power, turning Yorik's neural implant into a two-way conduit. Ilara, using her deep knowledge of neurobotany and biology, worked with Ren to create a chemical cocktail that would, hopefully, protect Yorik's conscious mind from being completely overwhelmed and assimilated during the process, grounding him in his own biological identity. They set up the experiment in the most shielded part of the command center. Jorik lay on a medical cot, his head connected by a thick cable to Ben's console. Alara stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Focus on one thing, Jorik," she instructed, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. "Not hate, not fear, not a demand, a question. The most basic one there is. What are you—" Ben initiated the sequence. The power in the command center dimmed as energy was channeled into the modified implant. On the console, the chaotic waveform of the entity's broadcast filled the screen. Then, a new signal appeared, a thin, clean sine wave originating from Yorik. On the cot, Yorik's body went rigid. His eyes, wide open, stared at the ceiling, but they were seeing something else entirely. "I'm in," he whispered, his voice distant. "It's a storm, a universe of noise. It's cold." Alara squeezed his shoulder gently. "The question, Jorik, just the question." Jorik's signal on the screen wavered, then solidified, modulating into a complex, repeating pattern that mirrored the structure of the entity's own broadcast. He was asking the question in its own language. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. The entity's storm of psychic noise continued unabated. They had failed. Then, a change. The chaotic waveform on the screen began to shift. The random, angry harmonics started to coalesce, to organize around Yorik's signal. The psychic pressure in the room, which had been a constant, nagging presence, suddenly snapped into a single, focused point. It was no longer a storm. It was a voice. The voice didn't come through the speakers. It bloomed inside every mind in the room, a concept transmitted without words, a feeling of immense age, of crushing loneliness, and of a singular, desperate hunger. And with that feeling came a single, terrifyingly clear image, imprinted directly into their consciousness, a vision of a dead star, cold and dark, and a world of pure crystal, shattered and dying, adrift in an empty void. Then came the answer to Jorik's question. It was not a word, but a feeling, a piece of information that chilled them to the marrow. It was a seed. It was a survivor. And it was starving. On the cot, a single tear rolled down Jorik's cheek. "My God," he choked out, his voice filled with a terrible, empathetic awe. "It's the last one. It's all alone." And outside, the humming from the crystalline spires stopped. The entire field went dark, plunging the landscape into the deep, natural twilight of Viridia for the first time in weeks. The silence was no longer analytical. It was attentive. It was listening. They had its attention, and now they had no idea what to do with it. The silence that fell over Terminus was a fragile, terrifying thing. The crystal field, no longer pulsing with malevolent energy or analytical light, was now a vast expanse of inert, black glass under the crimson twilight. The psychic pressure that had been a constant torment for weeks was gone, leaving behind a hollow ringing in the minds of the colonists, the phantom limb of a pain they had grown accustomed to. Inside the command center, the image imprinted on their minds lingered the dead star, the shattered crystal world, the overwhelming sense of ancient, cosmic solitude. It was a revelation that changed everything. They were not fighting a monster. They were being consumed by a refugee. On the cot, Jorik trembled, slowly returning to himself. The connection had been severed from the other side. He sat up, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes filled with a horrified understanding that went beyond anything the others had experienced. "It's not just hungry," he said, his voice raspy. "It's terrified. It's been drifting for eons. It landed here like a spore. This planet, the rock, the life. It's all just raw material. It doesn't understand the difference between converting a rock and converting a person. To it, it's all just matter. A way to rebuild its home." This new knowledge created a schism in the council. Elder Maeve saw a sliver of hope, a potential for communication, perhaps even coexistence. If it's intelligent, if it can feel fear and loneliness, then maybe it can be reasoned with, she argued, her voice trembling with the audacity of the idea. But Lyra, the scout who had seen Kale's soulless, crystallized form up close, was not convinced. Reasoned with it turned Kale into a puppet. It tried to drive us mad in our own homes. A starving animal is still an animal. Maeve, it will do whatever it takes to survive, and that means consuming us. Its fear doesn't make it any less of a threat. Her words resonated with the deep-seated fear of the colonists. They now understood their enemy's motive, but that motive was still their own extinction. Elara, however, was caught between these two poles. As a biologist, she saw the terrible logic of the entity's actions. It was an organism, the last of its kind, following a biological imperative to survive and reproduce. As a human, she felt the profound violation of its methods, but her mind latched onto a different part of the vision, the shattered crystal world. It hadn't just died, it had been broken. Something destroyed its home, she said quietly, her words cutting through the debate. It's not just a survivor, it's a victim of something else. Something that could break a world made of crystal. The implication hung in the air. A new and even greater fear. What could possibly be a predator to a planetary-scale crystalline intelligence? Their debate was interrupted by a new alert. Not from the crystal field, but from the sky. The colony's long-range sensors, salvaged from the Dawnbreaker and mostly used for weather tracking, were screaming. Something was entering Viridia's atmosphere, a massive object on a controlled descent. It was not the clumsy tumbling trajectory of a meteor. It was a ship. Hope, wild and irrational, surged through the command center. The Terran conglomerate. Had they been monitoring Terminus all along? Had they finally come back for them? Jorik rushed to the comm station, hailing the incoming vessel on every conglomerate frequency he knew. The response that came back was not human. It was a burst of harsh, guttural clicks and whistles, a language that grated on the ear. And then, a synthesized voice, speaking stilted, grammatically perfect Terran, filled the room. "Cease your transmissions. Colonial remnants. This world is under quarantine by the authority of the Cathar Imperium. The xylose contamination is to be sterilized. Your existence is noted and irrelevant." The message repeated on a loop. Sterilized. The word landed like a death sentence. The Cathar Imperium. A name whispered in the data logs of the Dawnbreaker. A ruthless, expansionist empire known for its brutal efficiency and its view of any non-Cathar life as either a resource or a pest. Elara's blood ran cold. The predator had arrived. The Cathar were not here to fight the crystal. They were here to scour the planet clean of it. And the human colony was just collateral damage in a pest control operation. A massive, wedge-shaped vessel. Its hull, the color of bruised iron, descended through the perpetual twilight, casting an immense shadow over the settlement. It was a warship, bristling with weapon emplacements. It ignored Terminus completely, its attention focused entirely on the now inert crystal field. Without warning, a beam of incandescent white energy lanced down from the ship's belly, striking the center of the field. The impact was silent, but the ground shook violently. Where the beam hit, the black crystal didn't dissolve or shatter. It sublimated, turning directly from a solid into a cloud of shimmering, gaseous particles that were instantly siphoned up by a secondary beam. This was no chemical reaction. It was molecular disassembly. The Cathar were mining their enemy, harvesting it as a resource while they destroyed it. The reaction from the crystal entity was instantaneous and desperate. The psychic silence was broken by a piercing scream of pure terror, a mental shockwave that made everyone in the command center cry out and clutch their heads. This was not the rage they had felt before. This was the death cry of a cornered animal. The entire crystal field erupted in a frenzy of defensive activity. Huge, jagged walls of crystal shot up from the ground, trying to block the beam. Crystalline spears, the size of trees, launched themselves into the air, arcing towards the Cathar ship, only to be vaporized by its point defense systems hundreds of meters from the hull. The crystal was powerful, a planetary force, but it was like a medieval army trying to fight a spaceship. It was outclassed, outgunned, and being systematically dismantled. Watching the slaughter, a strange and terrible choice began to dawn on Ilara. Their enemy, the entity that had tried to consume them, was being annihilated, but its destroyer was an even greater threat, one that had already written them off as an acceptable loss. The enemy of my enemy. The thought was insane. "Ben," she said, her voice urgent. "Can you re-establish the link with Jorik?" Ben stared at her, horrified. Why that thing is being torn apart because its enemy is about to turn that beam on us." Ilara shot back. "The Cathar aren't here to rescue us. They're here to sterilize the planet. That includes us. Right now, we have one thing, and only one thing. In common with that crystal, we both want that ship gone." Jorik, his face grim, nodded his assent. He understood the brutal calculus of the situation. He lay back on the cot, his jaw set. "Do it." The process was faster this time. As Ben re-established the connection, Jorik didn't just broadcast a question, he pushed a stream of pure, unadulterated data at the dying entity tactical readouts of the Cathar ship from the Dawnbreaker's old databases, their own failed attempts to damage the crystal, the chemical formula for the Ignis Moss enzyme, the frequency of their sonic fence. He gave it everything. He gave it their knowledge. He was offering an alliance. The psychic scream of terror from the crystal faltered, replaced by a surge of confusion, and then comprehension. In the field, the chaotic, desperate defense stopped. The crystal spears stopped launching. The walls stopped growing. For a moment, it seemed to be surrendering. The Cathar continued their relentless assault, the beam carving a massive scar through the field. Then, the ground at the very edge of the crystal field, near the volcanic vents where Ilara had first provoked it, began to change. The crystal there was not forming walls or spears. It was growing downwards, burrowing deep into the planet's crust with incredible speed. It was ignoring the ship above and focusing its remaining energy on something below. Ilara understood immediately. The magma conduits. She breathed. "It's going for the magma conduits." Viridia was a geologically volatile world. Just beneath the thin crust of the Twilight Belt were massive, pressurized channels of molten rock. The crystal wasn't attacking the ship anymore. It was turning the entire planet into a weapon. "Warn them," Elder Maeve whispered, looking at the Cathar ship. "We have to warn them." Yorick shook his head, a grim smile on his face. They wouldn't listen. Their message was clear. We are irrelevant on the battlefield. The crystal's strategy became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just tapping into the heat. It was absorbing the immense pressure. A network of new crystal formations began to grow on the surface. Intricate, hollow structures that looked like giant focusing lenses, all aimed at the Cathar ship. The Cathar commander, sensing a change in tactics, intensified the beam, trying to sever the crystal's connection to the geothermal vents. But it was too late. The crystal entity, armed with human knowledge of physics and geology, did something no brute force organism could have conceived of. It didn't just release the pressure, it shaped it. A series of perfectly timed, controlled eruptions burst from the ground. They were not explosions of lava. They were focused blasts of supersonic gas and superheated rock, planetary scale-shaped charges, all directed by the crystal lenses. The ship's shields flared, absorbing the first few impacts. But the barrage was relentless. 100 volcanoes erupting in perfect synchrony. A visible strain appeared on the ship's energy screen. Alarms, audible even from the ground, blared from the vessel. Then, with a final, massive, focused blast from directly beneath it, the Cathar ship's main drive section buckled. The energy beam cut out. The vessel listed heavily to one side, trailing plasma and smoke. It was crippled. The humans in the command center watched in stunned silence. They had given their mortal enemy the knowledge to defeat a far greater one. The Cathar ship, no longer a symbol of invincible power, began a slow, uncontrolled descent towards the far side of the Twilight Belt, destined to crash into the frozen wastes of the frost. The alliance had worked, and now they were alone on the planet again, with a vastly intelligent, wounded, and grateful crystalline entity that now knew every single one of their secrets. The aftermath of the Cathar ship's fall was an eerie, resonant silence. The vessel had crashed miles away in the frost, its death a distant flare of light against the permanent darkness, followed by a quiet that felt heavier than any sound. The crystal field, which had acted as a planetary weapon, fell dormant once more. The focusing lenses retracted into the earth, and the angry, weaponized glow faded, leaving the landscape under the soul. Crimson light of Helios, the psychic channel, which Yorick had held open, did not sever. Instead, the entity's presence changed. The terror and desperation were gone, replaced by a calm, pulsing wave of something akin to gratitude. It was a feeling of a shared victory, a complex chord of relief and newfound respect. A new image bloomed in their minds, not an imprint of memory this time, but a proposition. It was a vision of the Twilight Belt, but different. The blue crystal was not overriding the glimmerwood, but integrating with it. Crystalline lattices grew on the giant fungi, not consuming them, but amplifying their natural bioluminescence. Veins of crystal ran through the soil, not sterilizing it, but acting as conduits for water and nutrients, creating pockets of impossible fertility. It was a vision of symbiosis, a world where the silicon-based life of the Xylos and the carbon-based life of Viridia and its human colonists could merge, creating something new, something stronger. It was an offer of peace. In the command center, the colonists looked at each other, stunned. They had been prepared for a resumption of hostilities, for a betrayal, for anything but this. The entity, which they now knew was called the Xylos, was not just a mindless survivor. Armed with their knowledge, it had learned the concept of alliance, of mutual benefit. It had seen that destruction was not the only path to survival. The choice was now theirs. Could they trust it? Could they live alongside a being that had so recently tried to assimilate them? It was Ilara who gave the answer. She thought of the Glimmerwood, of its complex web of predator and prey, of parasite and host, a system that thrived not on simplistic harmony, but on a dynamic, often brutal, balance. "We never had a choice to live alone," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "We were marooned here. We adapted. Or we died. The Xylos is the same. It was marooned here. It did what it knew to survive. We showed it a new way. Now, we have to learn to adapt together." The years that followed were a strange and wondrous era of reconstruction, a slow, cautious dance of two entirely alien forms of life learning to coexist. There were no treaties signed or speeches made. The peace was built moment by moment, through shared action and observation. The colonists, led by Ilara and a council that now included a humbled and profoundly changed Yorick, began to work with the Xylos. They learned to communicate more clearly, using Ben's modified harmonic broadcaster not as a weapon, but as a tool. They showed the Xylos the boundaries of their settlement, and the crystal respected them, its growth halting at a mutually understood perimeter. In return, the Xylos began to share its gifts, crystalline conduits, grown with surgical precision, tapped into the planet's geothermal energy, providing Terminus with a limitless source of clean power. The settlement's crude hydroponic bays were transformed into lush, geocrystalline gardens, where earthly crops grew alongside viridian flora in a perfect, symbiotic environment. Ilara became the primary liaison between the two species. She spent her days not in the Glimmerwood, but in the new, integrated landscape that was forming in the Twilight Belt. She learned that the Xylos could create tools, shaping its own substance into everything from microscopic medical probes to massive, load-bearing archways. The colonists, in turn, shared their knowledge of engineering, of medicine, of art. They played music for the Xylos, and the crystal fields learned to resonate in complex, beautiful harmonies, creating symphonies of light and sound that filled the twilight air. Kyle, the first victim of the assimilation, was not forgotten. The Xylos, in an act of what could only be described as remorse, could not return him to his human form, but it released his consciousness. His crystallized body became a living monument in the center of the settlement, and his mind, now part of the Xylos' vast consciousness, acted as a permanent, stable bridge between the two species, a translator and an ambassador. He was a constant reminder of the cost of their conflict and the profound potential of their peace. The crashed Cathar ship was a source of both danger and opportunity. A joint team of humans and Xylos constructs ventured into the frost to salvage what they could. They found advanced alloys, powerful energy cores, and, most importantly, a functional star chart and the ship's log. The logs confirmed Ilara's fear the Cathar Imperium was a vast, predatory force. and the sterilization of Viridia was just one minor operation in a galactic campaign of conquest. They had not been forgotten. They had simply not returned, likely assuming the Xylos's planetary weapon had destroyed their vessel utterly. The knowledge that this greater threat existed cast a long shadow, but it did not break their spirit. Instead, it galvanized them. They were no longer just the forgotten colonists of Terminus. They were the inhabitants of Viridia, a new, hybrid world. They began to use the Cathar technology, integrating it with Xylo's biology and human ingenuity. The Dawnbreaker, the symbol of their isolation, was slowly dismantled, its components repurposed. They began to build a new ship, a vessel that was not just a machine of metal and circuits, but a living, semi-sentient craft grown from a crystalline matrix and powered by geothermal energy. Jork oversaw the new Joint Security Force, training humans to fight alongside sentient crystal constructs that could shift their form from shield to spear in a heartbeat. Lyra led expeditions that charted not just the planet, but the local star system, using small scout ships built from their new hybrid technology. Ben became the architect of their new world, designing systems where human and Xylos tech were seamlessly interwoven. Years passed. Children were born who had never known a world without the silent, singing crystal. They learned to communicate with the Xylos as easily as they spoke to each other, their minds more adaptable to the harmonic language. Terminus was no longer a name that meant the end. It was now simply Viridia, a single, unified world. One day, a much older Ilara stood on a high ridge overlooking the settlement. It was no longer a cluster of crude buildings, but a vibrant city of glowing crystal and green, living architecture, a testament to their impossible journey. She looked up at the crimson smear of Helios, a sun that never set, and then at the stars that were just becoming visible in the deepening twilight. Their new ship, the Synergy, was nearly complete, resting in a crystalline cradle on the horizon. It was a vessel of peace and exploration, but it was also a warship, a guardian for their home. They knew the Cathar, or some other threat, might one day return. The universe was a vast and dangerous place, but they were no longer afraid. They were not the weakest. They were not rejects or ghosts. They were something new, something forged in conflict and tempered by understanding. They were Viridian, and they were ready. Their journey had not ended. It had just begun. They were the unlikely alliance born in the twilight, and they were ready to bring their strange, beautiful light to the stars.